We begin in Munich, in the shadow of the building once known as the Brown House, the headquarters of the Nazi Party. Here, long before the first tanks rolled or the first bombs fell, Hitler's failures were already taking shape. Hitler's belief system was rooted in racial ideology rather than strategic logic. His goals were not simply military, they were ideological quests for conquest, extermination, and domination. And from these objectives, every major mistake of the war would grow. By 1939, Germany had been rebuilt into a fearsome military power. Blitzkrieg tactics, fast, coordinated assaults using tanks, aircraft, and infantry, brought shocking victories. Poland fell in weeks. Denmark and Norway were taken with stunning speed. France collapsed in just 6 weeks, despite having one of the largest armies in Europe. To much of the world, Hitler looked invincible. But these early victories created an illusion, one that convinced Hitler he understood war better than his generals. This overconfidence became one of the most destructive strategic failures in modern history. Our journey turns east, following the path of Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941. It was the largest invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union, stretching across a front more than 1,800 miles long. Hitler was convinced that the Soviet Union would collapse within months. He described it as, quote, a rotten structure. But his assumptions ignored intelligence reports, industrial data, and logistical realities. The Soviet Union was not weak. It had vast reserves of manpower. It possessed deep industrial capacity, much of which could be moved eastward beyond German reach. And its harsh climate, its endless distances, and its fortified cities had broken invaders before. But Hitler did not listen to experts. He listened to ideology. He believed Slavic peoples were inferior. He believed communism would collapse instantly. He believed the Red Army was fragile. And because he believed these things, he refused to plan for a long war. That refusal was fatal. German supply lines stretched hundreds of miles. Railways used a different gauge. Fuel and ammunition ran short. Thousands of vehicles broke down. And still, Hitler ordered his army to push deeper. By October, German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow. Winter came early. Temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Celsius. Equipment failed. Soldiers froze. Horses died by the tens of thousands. And Hitler refused to let his troops retreat or regroup. By Christmas, the German invasion was broken. The Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive, pushing the invaders back and shattering the myth of German invincibility. Operation Barbarossa had failed, and it failed because Hitler allowed ideology to dictate strategy. To the west, in the aftermath of France's defeat, Hitler had imagined a comfortable stalemate with Britain. But British resistance, particularly during the Battle of Britain, prevented Germany from gaining air superiority. Hitler shifted attention away from Britain to the Soviet Union before the UK could be neutralized. This was a critical mistake. The war became a two-front conflict, a scenario German military leaders had warned against since World War I. Then, in December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. And without any strategic necessity, Hitler declared war on the United States. It was an impulsive decision, a reckless one. Hitler underestimated the industrial power of the United States. He dismissed the American military as weak and inexperienced. But U.S. factories soon produced tanks, ships, and aircraft in quantities that dwarfed anything Germany could match. By declaring war on the United States, Hitler transformed the conflict into a global coalition against him. The British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States, 3 nations with enormous manpower, resources, and industrial strength, now aligned toward a common goal: Germany's defeat. Hitler started a war he could not win. To fully grasp Hitler's failures, we travel south to the deserts of North Africa. Here, German forces under General Erwin Rommel, skilled, fast-moving, and innovative, made early gains. But Hitler refused to prioritize the African campaign. He sent just enough men and equipment to prolong the fighting, but not enough to win decisively. Meanwhile, British forces destroyed German supply convoys across the Mediterranean. Fuel shortages crippled the German advance. Tanks sat helpless in the sand. Italy, Germany's ally, faltered repeatedly. Hitler was forced to divert troops to Greece and Crete, delaying Operation Barbarossa by several vital weeks. These delays meant German forces entered the Soviet Union just as the infamous Russian winter approached. Rommel once wrote that without fuel, his army was like a bird without wings. And those missing supplies reflected a larger truth. Hitler had no coherent strategy for global coordination. He fought several disconnected wars at once, each draining resources from the others. To stand in the modern city of Volgograd, once Stalingrad, is to stand on the soil of one of the most decisive battles in human history. Here, between 1942 and 1943, Hitler made a catastrophic strategic choice. He demanded the capture of Stalingrad, not for military necessity, but because it bore the name of his ideological enemy. The city symbolized everything he wanted to destroy. As German forces advanced, Soviet defenders fought street by street. Factories continued producing weapons, even as shells smashed through their walls. Soviet reinforcements crossed the Volga River under constant fire. By autumn, German troops had taken most of the city. But then the Soviets launched a massive encirclement operation, trapping over 250,000 German soldiers. Hitler ordered them to stand fast. He forbade surrender. He promised that supplies would arrive from the air, even though the Luftwaffe could deliver barely a fraction of what was required. The Sixth Army starved. It froze. Ammunition dwindled. And yet Hitler refused withdrawal. In February 1943, the Sixth Army surrendered. It was the first major German capitulation of the war. Only a small fraction of its soldiers ever returned home. Stalingrad was the turning point. After this defeat, Germany could no longer initiate strategic offensives on the Eastern Front. Hitler had sacrificed one of his best armies out of ego, symbolism, and denial. Wars are not won by battles alone. They are won by factories, resources, and sustained production. And Hitler's economic decisions were riddled with failure. Germany never fully mobilized its economy until late in the war. Civilian goods continued to be manufactured even as shortages grew. Women, who played major roles in Allied industrial production, were not mobilized in the same numbers in Germany. Oil, the lifeblood of mechanized warfare, was in perpetual short supply. Allied bombing campaigns destroyed refineries and transport lines. Synthetic fuel plants were repeatedly targeted. Tanks sat idle for lack of gasoline. Aircraft remained grounded. Meanwhile, Hitler funneled resources into experimental wonder weapons, the V-2 rocket, massive tanks like the Maus, and jet projects that arrived too late and in too small numbers to make a difference. German scientists were talented, but Hitler's obsession with miracle solutions diverted resources from practical needs. Industrial capacity dwindled. The economy that once fueled blitzkrieg could no longer sustain even basic operations. As we move toward the war's final years, Hitler's failures become increasingly personal. His leadership deteriorated drastically. He micromanaged battles from afar. He issued rigid orders demanding the defense of every village, every hill, every position. No retreats, no flexibility. Generals who disobeyed were dismissed, demoted, or worse. Intelligence reports were ignored. Advisors were silenced. Internal resistance grew, culminating in the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt, an event that convinced Hitler that betrayal lurked everywhere. After the attempt, he trusted almost no one. His decisions grew more erratic, more detached from reality. He moved military units on maps without regard for their actual strength. He demanded counterattacks from divisions that no longer existed. Meanwhile, Allied forces advanced from both east and west. The Red Army crushed German lines. American and British forces liberated France after D-Day and pushed toward the German border. Hitler responded not with strategic insight, but with delusional orders for non-existent reinforcements. The once fearsome German military machine was collapsing. By early 1945, the Third Reich was reduced to rubble. Cities were destroyed. Industry lay in ruins. Millions were dead. And yet Hitler refused surrender. In April, Soviet troops encircled Berlin. Fighting raged street by street. German forces, exhausted and outnumbered, could no longer hold. Inside a bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler spent his final days issuing impossible commands to formations that no longer existed. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet forces closed in, he took his own life. 1 week later, Germany formally surrendered. The war in Europe was over. As our journey draws to a close, we return to the central question: why did Hitler fail? The answer lies not in a single battle or a single decision, but in a pattern of profound and consistent failures. He allowed ideology to override strategy. He launched wars without supply lines. He underestimated enemies repeatedly. He ignored geographic realities. He fought too many fronts at once. He micromanaged experienced commanders. He refused to retreat, even when survival demanded it. He placed faith in symbolic victories over practical ones. He attacked nations with greater resources, greater populations, and greater industrial output. And he made decisions based on prejudice, ego, and delusion, rather than evidence and analysis. Hitler failed because his worldview was fundamentally incompatible with reality. His policies, his strategies, and his beliefs contained the seeds of his own destruction. Across the battlefields of Europe, history leaves behind a powerful reminder. The rise of the Third Reich was built on violence, segregation, hatred, and lies. Its fall was the inevitable result of those same forces turned inward, collisions between fantasy and fact, ideology and truth. Hitler believed his empire would last 1,000 years, but his failures ensured it would not last even 12. Understanding how and why his regime collapsed is more than a study of war. It is a lesson in the consequences of unchecked power, distorted ideology, and catastrophic leadership. And it is a reminder that history's darkest chapters often end not because evil is invincible, but because it is profoundly, fundamentally flawed. This has been our journey through the story of how Hitler failed in World War II.